I'm Zim, and this is the Helpful Photographer Podcast, in collaboration with New York City Photo Safari. To register for a safari, please visit newyorkcityphotosafari.com. Straight out of camera, the endless debate. As a professional shooter who was formally trained to shoot on film more than 20 years ago, I've heard all the debates about what quote-unquote real photography is and what it means. And I gotta tell you folks, this debate is as old as photography, and it's a tired debate. And I know what I'm going to say here will get me tons of heat and hate, but I'm from New York, and so I'm ready to get in the mud. So here it goes. Lately, the debate around quote-unquote real photography is centered around the phrase straight out of camera, also known as SOOC. I assume it's pronounced sock or sook, but I'm just gonna go with stupid. You know why? 'Cause suck was just a little too obvious. Yeah, you heard me right. I said it. So, this phrase is being used to describe images that allegedly have no editing. In other words, they're presented straight out of camera, and it's held up as the standard by which we should all strive to attain in our photographs. Which is kind of ridiculous. And shall I say it again? Stupid. Yeah, I said it again. So oftentimes I'm asked if I think the use of Photoshop is cheating, or another way of asking the same question is whether or not I think it's wrong to use filters like what you get on Instagram. My answer is straight up no. I don't think using Photoshop is cheating, and I don't think using filters in post-process or anywhere is wrong. It just is what it is. Before I go on, let me back up and start from the beginning. When photography became more widespread and artists began to realize that photography could be used to do more than just create a quick headshot or a family portrait, the art community asked the question, is photography art? Many argued that photography wasn't art because it was too real and too easy. After all, wasn't art supposed to be an expression of one's imagination? Photography was and still is often perceived as simply documentation. Nothing more, nothing less. Just like a map or a phone book, perhaps. Therefore, it cannot be considered art. But when the Dada and abstract movement came along, critics argued that those forms of art weren't real enough, and therefore, it too wasn't art. So, on the one hand, people argued that one form of art was too real, while the other wasn't real enough. I know you can't see me, but imagine me pounding my head on the desk here. Although I would like to believe that we have mostly matured away from these debates, I often find that they haven't gone away. Instead, they've only shifted a bit. Today, the same question is being asked differently. And the question is not whether or not photography is art, but rather, is it photography? So it's the same question with a different disguise. And I find the question is invariably mostly asked by those who believe themselves to be the arbiters of photography and art. I want everyone to remember that the artists who created the Dada movement created it as a huge middle finger pointed directly at those who thought they were the arbiters of art of the time. I remember about 15 years ago, I was at a lecture where the photographer showed images created digitally. She was able to montage her image in camera via multiple exposure to get the perfect exposure, which would have been extremely difficult in film. A person in the audience raised their hand and asked, "But is this still photography?" And this remains the current debate. If we press the button more than once or manipulate our images in any way after pressing the button, is it still considered photography? Or is it somehow cheating? And my answer is emphatically yes, it's still photography, and no, it's not cheating. Okay, now that I got that out of my system, here's what I think everyone needs to remember. Other than Polaroids, chrome, or any direct-to-viewing method of photography, all film photography required some level of post-process manipulation. When we were shooting film, even before we put that image on paper, how we handled our chemistry could dramatically alter the look of our images. From simple temperature manipulation to cross-processing. And if you don't know what cross-processing is, just simply Google it. The point is that we have always manipulated our images. Even with images that don't seem to have been manipulated, we have to step back and consider that when the printer printed the film to a piece of paper, the printer made decisions on how dark or light or contrasty or not contrasty to make that print. And furthermore, The printer made decisions as to how to crop the image because most of the time the size of the print was not proportional to the aspect ratio of the film. We have always manipulated our images. These days, we're just doing it in a computer. And before somebody argues the quote-unquote fact that they can present great images straight out of camera, I'm willing to assume that that image was shot either on a smartphone or as a JPEG, in which case the camera applied some level of post-process to the image, and if it was on a smartphone, it was a lot of post-processing. And although it happened automatically, it nonetheless did happen. In my last 200,000 frames, I can tell you I only had one shot that I was able to present straight out of camera. And at the end of the day, it looked even better with a tiny bit of post-process. Another thing I would like everyone to consider is the use of filters. Not the digital kind, but the piece of glass or plastic that you put in front of your lens. If I put a glass filter on my lens, is that any different than if I applied a digital filter that does the exact same thing? Would that still be considered straight out of camera? So the bottom line is that pretty much all images require some level of post-process. So why should it be considered an illegitimate way of working? I think the only time when it is not legitimate is to manipulate an image beyond contrast, light and dark, and some color when it is being presented as a journalistic or documentary image. I do not believe it is legitimate to add something that wasn't there or delete something that was there if you're a journalist or documentary photographer and are representing your images as true to life. Having said this, we have to keep in mind that the photographer chooses how and where to crop the image during the act of taking the photo, and that in itself is a manipulation of the scene. We must remember that a photograph can never be more than what the photographer saw in front of them, and that each of us sees the world differently, even if we are standing side by side. When I said it's not legitimate for a journalist to delete something from a photo, I mean like taking a person out of a crowd, or photoshopping out something that was captured. You'll have to decide if cropping out a material piece of information is legitimate. By the way, none of this is to say that you shouldn't try to get it perfect in the camera. Of course you should. Getting it as close as possible to what you want the end product to be while shooting is a good and worthy goal, because most of us prefer to be behind our cameras than in front of our computer screens. But disqualifying an image because there was some kind of post-process involved is just dumb. Oops, did I say it again? Yeah, I did. So is it still photography if you photoshopped it? Yes, it is. Is using a filter cheating? No, it's not. The question we should be asking is whether or not we actually like the image that is being presented in front of us. And if the answer is, I like it, then great. If the answer is, I hate it, well, just move on to another image. For the most part, photographers and the community at large believe that photography is art. And I find that the argument of whether or not an image qualifies as photography to be a destructive one, both to our profession and our photographic community at large. In my opinion, if it was originally created with light, then it's photography. The only question to be asked is whether or not you like it. And that's my rant. Thanks for indulging me, and thanks for listening. Until next time, keep on shooting.